So hello and welcome to our conversation today on make or break race and ethnicity in entry-level compensation for arts administrators in Los Angeles County. The recently published report from LA County Department of Arts and Culture and our Center for Business and Management of the Arts, or CBMArts at Claremont Graduate University. If you haven't already, you can access that report on the county's website at www.lacountyarts.org/article/make or break, or just do a search online for LA County and make or break report, and it comes up right at the top of your results already. My name is Jonathan Neal. I'm the director of CBMArts at CGU. Before we begin, I'd like to get just the standard housekeeping out of the way. So if you wouldn't mind, please turn off your screens and you mute your microphones. That way we will see only the panelists for the time being until we get to the Q&A section. We'll have an opportunity for, and we do encourage questions in the second half of our time together today. And I'll introduce the protocol for that Q&A just prior to when we want to open up to the audience. But if you have questions early, don't hesitate to put those into the chat as we are talking, and we'll certainly make an effort to get to those questions as we open up to the question and answer session. In the interest of time, I'm only going to offer the briefest of introductions for our participants so that we can get the conversation started, but we'll be also putting their full bios in the chat where you can read them at your own leisure. So today, joining us is, to begin with, Helen Alonso Hurtado. She's the Social Enterprise Manager at Las Fotos Project, an organization that empowers teenage girls from communities of color through photography, self-expression, and mentorship. Hello, Helen. Also joining is John Jung-Hoon Lee, who's an artist and curator and educator who has worked with and for a number of organizations here in Los Angeles, both nonprofits and in the commercial sector. Welcome, John. And Bronwyn Malden, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Los Angeles Department of Arts and Culture, an adjunct faculty in our master's programs, and co-author of Make or Break that has brought us here together. Hello, Bronwyn. And finally, Kobe Krieger, who is the other co-author of that report, is an independent arts administrator and an alum of our arts management program from 2019. Hello, Kobe, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. So Kobe, I'd like to begin with you and the genesis of this report, if you wouldn't mind. What brought you to the research question of entry-level compensation and to the problem of pay disparities in the arts?
Thanks for the question, Jonathan. My undergrad education is in art history and accounting, and in my first stages as a practitioner and arts administrator in the arts, I became very conscious of the ecosystem and how it transits money and value from different entities in the arts ecosystem. And so I've always been sort of aware to the way money or salaries or compensation can demonstrate value or priorities. And it surprised me when arriving to Los Angeles from a very vibrant city in the world. I'm from Tel Aviv, Israel, but far less funded, resourced, and developed in terms of infrastructure, that many of the wealthiest institutions were offering entry-level salaries or unpaid internships that were not adequate to the living costs of what was required here in LA County. Concurrently, I was taking in a lot of information about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the cultural equity inclusion initiative specifically by the LA County Department of Arts and Culture. And it struck me, it was sort of odd to me that there was no mention of salaries and how they act, low salaries particularly, and how they act as a barrier to people that can't afford to live and on such a low salary, and, or more accurately, as the study suggests, can't find alternative sources of income to support their low salary. And it quickly came to mind that salary is effectively a racial barrier and a socioeconomic barrier, by way of socioeconomic barriers, because race is correlated with earnings and wealth in the United States. We all know that, we all experience that. It plays out very, very differently for arts administrators of color. And if LA County and its arts institutions really feel passionate and important, as I suspect they do through the resources that they apply to solving this issue, it surprised me that no one was talking about compensating people.
I have to unmute myself, apologies. Bronwyn, would you mind telling us a little bit about how the project that Kobe brought forward fits into the larger projects at LA County Department of Arts and Culture and the broader sort of cultural equity initiative that has been ongoing with the county as well?
Sure. The Department of Arts and Culture has had what has been called a Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative that was launched by the Board of Supervisors back in 2015. And as part of that launch, my research team did a literature review of kind of what was already known about diversity, equity, inclusion in the arts, or lack thereof. And that was followed up by a series of town hall meetings. There were recommendations that were brought from community members and compiled into a report that went to the Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors then funded a number of those recommendations, and that there is a Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative Advisory Committee that continues to meet and to work on these issues and to advise the department and the Arts Commission. And what began as a standalone initiative has become kind of the center of how we do our work at the department. So way back in 2019, when I was teaching research and evaluation for the arts at CBMArts, and Kobe had proposed this project as his final project in the class, and came to me afterwards and asked, "Do you think I could really do this study?" And I said, not only could you, you should, and let's find a way to work together. Because as Kobe says, the issue of salaries, earnings for arts administrators, we've done research so that we know the demographic makeup of the arts workforce in LA County, and we have an ongoing study where we are looking at that every few years, but we hadn't had an opportunity to look at salaries or at earnings. And I think no one is surprised by the findings. I think we found what we expected to find, but we found much more. I think the gap is greater than what we expected. And there are some really interesting nuances in the report that make the report worth reading in its entirety. But it also made it worth it for us to work with Kobe to get this report and to get it out there in the world so that we can start to have conversations like this, where we go from, okay, we knew there was a problem, we've now quantified the problem, so let's get to work on solutions.
I think that's super important. And so, Helen, I'm gonna turn to you now and ask you. You've got a ton of experience across different organizations in Los Angeles. What in the report in particular resonated with you with your prior experience? But then I'd also love to hear from you how some of that informs your own work at Las Fotos Project, particularly the social enterprise initiative with which you're primarily involved, and pointing the way towards some of these solutions towards these pay inequities in the arts here in LA County, but also in other places.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jonathan. When I first read the report and discussed it with our team, none of us were surprised. We all come from a variety of backgrounds in education, as designers, as arts administrators. And I think what resonated for each of us was the fact that a lot of our colleagues, a lot of our peers that are working in these art spaces have to take on second jobs, or they're freelancing, or they're hustling and producing all the time. And I think this act of always needing to produce and always needing to find a way to live can be very toxic. And it's something that we really try to break down in our CEO program. So our CEO program is Creative Entrepreneurship Opportunities. It's our flagship social enterprise. And it's a career training program for our students at Las Fotos Project who want to enter LA's creative economy. And so they receive weekly training not only in photography, but also in finances and how to set their prices, how to develop their portfolios. And something that we've been really focused on is how do we ground our students in an abundance mindset? How do we ground our students in knowing their worth and knowing that their worth comes from their creativity and not their productivity? And how they can then use that mindset to set prices that really honor their work and honor their expertise and honor their creative vision and what they bring to the table. And so for me, like going through this experience of having worked 2 jobs, when I first started my career in arts administration, I was still catering when I started my first full-time job. And to now, you know, that experience has shown me that I would like our students to not have to pursue that path and have to be hustling in multiple places of employment, but rather can focus on their art and can focus on the path that they want for themselves and the vision that they have for their life.
And is there, for the students that come through your program, is there a kind of a need to sort of shift the mindset in terms of going for abundance, establishing the value of their own creativity and their own worth to the field, but understanding too that are they going out thinking of this as sort of they're going into the commercial field, and so that they can demand a little bit more, they don't feel like they're compromising as much with an idea of mission? How does that, I think that becomes a divide. And John, I'm going to ask you the same question in a second, but I was sort of curious about how it is that you talk about that with your students in particular, because we find in the arts in particular, there's this kind of like trade-off between when it's for mission, we're willing to take a little bit less. If it's for money, we're going to ask for, you know, exactly what we think we're owed.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, that's a conversation we're always having with our students. Most of our students are first generation. Most of our students share a very similar experience to myself, where we're the first in our families to navigate college and like a professional work setting. And, you know, I think something that I always encourage our students to think about is, why are you entering this field? What are you hoping to gain from it? And then what are the things you're not willing to compromise on? And I think as much as I share that with our students, they always constantly remind me of that. Because when we go out and do workshops, community workshops that people contract us for, when I bring the price back to the students that I'm going to suggest to the client, they're actually the ones who are like, actually, my time is worth more than that, and let's ask for this. And that's kind of the conversations I want to keep having with them.
That's great. Yeah. So John, sort of the same question. You've worked across both nonprofit and commercial organizations yourself, and so I'm curious to hear from you. You know, what are some of the differences that you've either seen in those organizations or that you've experienced of how to sort of manage this question of pay and equity as it's being negotiated by those different types of organizations?
Thank you for that question. I think my professional career last few years have been like highly dependent on like maneuverability, or just, you know, being able to be back and forth in different sectors of art. And, you know, like art world, like when you start in that industry, it's such a precarious market. And something that I've sort of observed is that like I started to think more about like how much I can endure in this, like, you know, working conditions, and like what are they providing, and like eventually thinking about where the money comes from, like where does my paycheck comes from. And working at like a nonprofit or museums, like I know that all the money essentially come from donors or some sort of like a membership support. It never comes from tickets, at least in the institution that I've worked at. And I think that's like super interesting that there's like a finite amount of money that like those individuals or like a group of people provide that will essentially be the budget. Whereas like for the commercial sector, like I definitely realize that like it is a little different, you know, like a lot of times you're selling something, selling like artwork, selling like service, and like that is very different source of like how money comes in, capital comes in. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it is interesting. I think it points in a way to this, to a sort of question of transparency. And I think that's another big one, that big issue that is discussed in the report, and is also sort of verges on how transparency as a principle or a value is treated in these different types of organizations, and even between different types of nonprofits themselves. Maybe Helen, maybe you could talk a little bit, we talked a little bit about sort of how we instill this in the students that you work with, but I know that Las Fotos Project as an organization itself kind of lives many of these ideals. So you could talk a little bit about how that operates for Las Fotos Projects itself, and we can move on from there.
Yeah, definitely. So Eric Ibarra, who is Las Fotos Project's founder, he is a visionary, and he is someone who's always making sure that the voices of women and women of color and youth of color are always at the forefront, and making sure that we're compensated what we're worth. And so part of that is he worked with our current executive director, Lucia Torres, and they developed a compensation model that's transparent for our entire organization. All of our coordinators begin at $20 an hour, and at the conclusion of each year, there is a pay increase, and we have access to everyone's salary at any given time. We know what each of us makes, we know what each of us is going to make, and we know kind of how we'll get there based on our evaluations and such. And so I think that model helps us to not be shamed into talking about pay. I feel like that's something so often in this field that we don't talk about how much we make with our peers and with our colleagues, or we'll whisper and say like, oh, so-and-so's getting paid this much at this institution. But I think it's really important that we destigmatize talking about our compensation, and that we have transparency not only within our own institutions, but across the field. And I think and not only transparency with us as colleagues, but also with our students. Our students have asked us what we make, and we share with them directly. They're interested in that. They want to know that because they themselves are exploring what a career in arts administration may be like, and what can be there in the future for them.
It's interesting. And John, sort of the same question. What is your experience in terms of the transparency levels at the various different types of organizations that you've worked at, and how do they or don't they live up to the kind of ideals that you see those organizations promoting, both in public or internally to their teams?
I think they're incredibly not transparent, and I think it is mainly from the fact that I was working a lot of like part-time or more like less involved positions as well, and yeah, to sort of go back to the question about the transparency, I mean, I think it's like also super interesting to like think about how like our world itself, like the industry itself, is like not really about transparency a lot of times. Like there's this performance of like, I mean, going back to sort of the idea of like endurance within like the industry, like people like, yeah, like I look at my peers and like I don't know if they have trust funds. I don't, like, people all sort of like present themselves in like especially in commercial sector, I've realized like they may be making so much like less than what I like expect, but then like they keep up sort of presenting a certain way that they're like, and I think that like was really confusing for me when I was actually like working at the field, like wait, like what is this lifestyle that you're sort of like living, and is this really like possible within like this like entry field or like certain fields of like art industry, and something that was also really interesting about the report is about the generational wealth and how that impacts career growth, like one's like presentation of the profession within like the field. In that sense, like I don't think transparency is anywhere in the art industry. Like it is really rare to see, and it's so heartwarming to hear about the Las Fotos project in that way, like that there's like people are talking about it really openly amongst the peers.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Jonathan, if I might jump in, because John's just brought up something that I think was one of my big takeaways from the report, and that is about the role of generational wealth. And I know that there is increasing research in the field about the role of generational wealth in people's lives more broadly, not just working in the arts, that it may be that generational wealth is much more explanatory of outcomes than just regular wages, because and we know, because we've talked about this in the arts, that you can take a risk on an unpaid job if you know you've got your family behind you. So that already puts you ahead, you know, at a different starting point. And then we think about people who have been socialized in the arts world because of who their family was, and who have networks in better paid jobs, and gives them that. And now we're looking at generational wealth in this study. We talked about that and in Kobe's interviews, and how that played out and experientially for people. I think this is an area that we need to get a lot more understanding of as well.
No, I thank you for bringing that up, Bronwyn. I'm sort of curious then, Kobe, I want to turn to you. So if we take what Bronwyn just said about sort of generational wealth being one of the sort of big areas for research and analysis, and understanding how that has very disparate outcomes, you know, 1 generation on, 2 generations on, 3 generations on, how does that then translate though into recommendations that the report comes up with for the future, right? Because, you know, dealing with the challenge of generational wealth is a much larger tax policy issue. It's a much larger, you know, this is not something necessarily that arts foundations and arts organizations can address directly. So I'm curious then, from the recommendation standpoint and some of the things that you brought up in the report, how you see those things intersecting with this sort of more systemic condition.
Well, the operative word being intersecting. Generational wealth exists in a very, very specific part of the art world, and it is the majority of the private funders that provide equity for most of these institutions in a way that is based on networks, yes, on one hand, but also through very tedious and thoughtful application processes. Philanthropy in the arts is one part of the pie, and funders have the ability through their application processes and their funding strategies to shape the field. And I think that's a place where the biggest part of generational wealth can actually attempt to democratize itself, interact directly with the field, and be proactive and say, we won't fund an organization unless they include a salary estimate when they post a job listing. We won't fund an organization that doesn't analyze its compensation structure and its demographics and fixes disparities. And I would hope that it would also apply strategies that would push arts organizations to offer compensation that is much more aligned with the cost of living in the metro areas where cultural activities is more robust, which is typically more expensive, and also coherent with the job requirements, namely education, which we know in the arts is one very, very common. Almost more than 90% have at least a bachelor's degree in our workforce. And not only is it common, it is very, very, very expensive. If I remember correctly, I think 8 out of 10 top master's programs in the US are art schools or something ridiculous like that. We ended up including figures that were related to arts administration programs, and they range, they vary, but some of them are very expensive. And if that could be part of a calculated risk that an applicant could take, that would be totally fine. People do that all over the world all of the time. They can take on a certain loan, afford a certain education, and expect the value of their labor enhanced by that education to even out. But we can't do that in arts administration. In fact, we set ourselves up for failure in the case that we are funding our education fully. I think that our education in our field is an amazing resource. I'm proud to say that our field is very, very educated, because I think what we do is very nuanced and very, very complex. but how does that translate into the price of our labor in the field, in the job market? That is something that generational wealth via funders can really, really do to change.
Yeah, I know that we've been taking a very hard look at this over the last couple of years from our own part as a university that offers these master's degrees in arts administration. We brought the cost of our programs down by 20%. We've had a sort of target of trying to look at what really is a 1 year starting salary in the field and trying to index that to what the cost of an education might actually be, so that we're not sort of so outrageously sort of 2x or 3x beyond what it is that someone might expect to earn in their first year out of the field. It's an interesting calculus to try and make work. I want to sort of continue this conversation because I think one of the first recommendations that you have was having funders take a look at the full cost project, right? And having funders really understand what the sort of the total dimension of organizational operations might be and what they need to do to fund everybody in that organization. And one of the interesting things about that project is, like, as you said, sometimes these funding applications are very bureaucratic. They're very labor intensive. That in of itself goes unpaid, right? It's sort of the promise of getting funded, but you spend, days and weeks and months trying to put in these great funding applications. And then part of the full cost projects directive is like, we can't be so paternalistic. You can't be holding, like, you need to be providing this money a little bit more free of the restrictions and treating your grant recipients as if they're sort of children at the table whose allowances need to be monitored and how they meet these things out. And so that's an interesting push and pull in terms of what we want funders to sort of require of their funding organizations now, in terms of the challenges of equity and sort of building in better resources, but then also wanting funders to kind of be a little bit more, for lack of a better word, laissez-faire, right? Like, let's provide this money without as many strings attached so that the organizations can kind of be set free to channel those funds how they see fit in the most equitable way or according to their own missions. It's an interesting push and pull. Do you see it's not a contradiction, but there's an interesting sort of challenge to be developed there. I don't know if Bronwyn or Kobe or anybody's got a sort of thought on that front.
I agree. I think there's an inherent tension there, but they're not mutually exclusive. And I would urge us to consider not without strings attached, but with acknowledgement of the expertise that people have on the ground when they're connected to their mission. It's not about being less involved and less responsible with how you with your grant making. It's reminding yourself that you're overlooking the primary resource that you should be you should be dependent on, which is the people and their experiences and what they know based on their actual interactions with their mission and their community. I'm sure Helen can say a lot about this and about how they interact with the idea of wealth and their leadership and their funders.
Yeah, would you comment on that, Helen?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, thank you, Kobe, for bringing up that point about it's not no strings attached. It's just changing changing the perception of these predominantly white funding institutions. I think one thing that comes up a lot for us is, who are the teaching artists that we want to work with? Who are the teaching artists that we want to be collaborating with our students? And so often there are people that we want to bring in to work with our youth that, if we were to present that to that person, to a funder, just because they don't have this level of education or this number of years in the field or X, Y, and Z credential, we wouldn't be allowed to bring them into a specific project. And, I feel like that's hurtful. That's hurtful for our students. That's hurtful for our community. And for us, it's always finding that balance of like, who's going to be working with our youth, but also just finding that balance of who's going to be working with our youth, who has the cultural understanding of our community. And I think it shows even in our staff. Most of our staff started as volunteers at Las Fotos Project. All of us that were offered a position there, it was because we were a part of that community or came from a community very similarly. And it's what allows our connections with our students to remain authentic and grounded and rooted. And it's what we try to have with anyone working with our students firsthand. But additionally, in terms of funders, yeah, that's a challenge that we discuss often, that I often commend Eric for starting Les Wiltos Project and the way it has grown, because he didn't have connections to funders or generational wealth. None of us do. And, you know, for us, we always are asking, how do we reconfigure wealth for ourselves? Like, how do we place value on connection and community versus who can be on our board and bring in fundraising dollars of 10,000 or more? You know, so when you look at our board, it's completely women-led, it's completely women of color-led, women identifying folks-led, and female identifying folks-led. And it's everyone comes from a different background. Everyone brings their own version of wealth to the board, their own version of expertise, and everyone contributes to our community in different ways. And we've done that also with our Sister Circle. Our Sister Circle is a group for women and non-binary folks to join us in creating a community of supporters for our students. And it's a monthly membership program where we provide monthly networking and professional development opportunities and talks and lectures. And it starts at $20 a month, people or less. People are just asked to give what they're able to, and they join our community of supporters. So it's not that we're looking for these big funders, because we believe that we have the wealth already in our community, and it's just about bringing everyone together to support us.
It's interesting. As you were talking and as Kobe was talking, it sort of struck me that, you know, I'm always looking at these kinds of comparisons between the nonprofit sector and the commercial sector. And, you know, even though the term investment is not the one that we like to see bandied about within the nonprofit sector, there is a sense in which when you see sort of venture capital funders or private equity funders go in to invest in a new initiative or new organization, what they're really doing is investing in those people and allowing them to then deploy that capital as they see fit for a achievable goal. And there isn't this kind of more paternalistic set of requirements and overwatch that's happening. And you know, and in a way, you could see that. Again, I'm not saying that we turn this into some sort of investment model, but you'd see there's a kind of language and there's a kind of discourse that's in those sectors that is a little bit freer with what they think that they are doing when they want to provide funding for organizations that are doing dynamic things, that have equitable structures, but that are seeing themselves excluded from certain types of funding practices because of this like strange sort of paternalistic model that's just become sort of handed down over time.
Yeah, I think for us, we're not afraid to use the word investment. Like when people provide us funds, we thank them for investing in our youth, for investing in our programs, for investing in the impact that's going to be had. And it's something that I talk about with our colleagues often, that as working as a social entrepreneur in this space, you know, it can be very frustrating when I see like tech companies that get millions and millions of dollars and have never turned a profit and probably may not ever go public. And then I look at the value of the work that we're doing in our space and thinking like, well, you can throw $1 million our way and that'd be great, because that money is going to be directly invested in the life of someone, not just like the manifestation of a physical product.
Right. And I also think that, you know, those are interesting things to look at too, because when we talk about the sort of impact of generational wealth and the inequities that creates down the system, in these other environments, we've seen, you know, huge amounts of wealth created in the technology, real estate, the entertainment and media fields, really from first generation people, right? I mean, we're talking about, you know, scales of wealth that have sort of been created that are not dependent upon sort of really entrenched legacies of privilege, which also offer a kind of unlocking of the possibility of new funding models, new investment models, and new ways of bringing that to bear in the arts, which I think just requires some of these very sort of enterprising organizations like Las Fotos and frankly, arts administrators who are willing to sort of speak up about it and to sort of demand the equity that they deserve. So I'm going to ask our audience to weigh in at this point. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat. I'll also, if you feel strongly that your own voice should be heard, by all means, please raise your hand and we'll sort of bring you into the conversation. But I know that we've had this sort of rich discussion and we have a number of people on the line. So I'd love to hear from everybody who's out there, and I'll do my best to switch back and forth between the chat and whoever else comes up on screen. So we do have a question here first from Dr. Lee. How will arts administrators at local, state, and regional arts organizations utilize this research and knowledge in transforming their hiring and organizational management structures? Do you have any examples in Los Angeles yet? So that might be a question, Kobe and or Bronwyn. The report's still pretty fresh, so I don't know if there's sort of immediate impact, but maybe we'll go to you first.
There is one impact. It's not an arts organization that hires arts administrators per se, but I will say Arts for LA has been a partner of this study, and so in that it has helped conceive and support the process of gathering responses in our survey, and have just generally provided counsel when they can. Arts for LA as itself is an arts organization that employs arts administrators, but more importantly, it sustains a job listing part of their website where they post different positions that become available in the arts or artist opportunities. And based on our discussion and their goals accompanying the study and at large, they have now made their job listings, they've made it mandatory to include a salary estimate in their job listings. And I've been told that some posters have attempted to post without, and those have been removed and then reinserted with a salary estimate. I think that's really important in terms of re-transparency and re-change and applicable change. And also, a fun fact, I've actually monitored this as much as I can, and I've seen a job listing go up the Arts for LA job board with a salary range, and I've seen it without a salary range on a different job board. So it really takes persistency for this. People really want to hold on to their opacity as much as they can.
That's one thing.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
It was so inspiring to read the report, because I think like as a person who's like working in the industry, it was like so good to sort of like see where I sit within this like render schema structure. And I think that awareness is also another big part within, you know, possible change within this industry, and this like income disparity and, you know, like racial biases, gender biases, like it, and also having this as like a quantitative data really like helps me. I feel like I can like speak to my boss better if I have any problem with like, you know, my pay or just the way I'm treated in the industry, because like I do now have like a solid research or like, you know, data that I can bring up and like, hey, like this is happening. So I don't know, just wanted to bring that part up from like more personal stance.
For sure. Another question here. This one, we know that the report really focused on entry-level positions. Is there any plan or any interest in subsequent study to look at executive level positions to see if there are disparities also in that arena and also bringing those things to light?
We haven't done that yet, but David, I think that's a fantastic idea, and I would like to get more information about that. One thing we have looked at in our demographic studies, because we've done them, we did one in 2016, 2017, and again in 2019, is there's a really interesting difference. The higher you, okay, arts workforce in LA County, no one is surprised to find out it is predominantly white and female, overwhelmingly. But the older you get in the workforce and higher ranking and more into executive positions and board positions, the more white it gets and the more male it gets. So I think we have a real opportunity to look at those disparities at higher levels, to look at boards, look at executives. I also would be interested in adding to that kind of a typology of organizations, because, you know, large, traditionally, historically well-funded, Eurocentric organizations compared to community-based organizations, and looking at if we see the same disparities there, I think would also be very interesting. There's so much more to mine here and to understand about what's going on in our field. I say that also knowing that I think a lot of people who are either on this panel and also those of y'all in the audience can probably predict what we would find. I don't think, I think we would find what we expect to find. I think this study showed that, but I think we could find some really interesting nuances and opportunities to look for change.
I think that's important. Why do you, so I'm gonna ask this question. So like, if we are just in the business of validating what we all already suspect and know, what, you know, why, this seems like an effort that we're putting into, you know, the numbers and the data, of course important, of course we want to have that, but it seems like there's a sort of, you know, the next step, and this is sort of, Kobe, going back to your Arts for LA comment too. You went through the innovator program at Arts for LA, and Arts for LA runs this very interesting initiative that brings in 10 or 12 advocates and innovators and sort of new venture creators in the arts to think about building exactly these new initiatives and new organizations and new programs within the arts that are sort of doing this type of thing. And I wonder, how, you know, Kobe, your experience there, and then how much that had sort of had an effect on how you thought about what are the types of programs that you could build coming out of this that would really be the answer to the problem that is being presented by the report.
I think a lot about alternatives. I really enjoyed and developed a lot of my thoughts about alternatives during the Activate Fellowship. And that's actually how I got connected to Las Fotos project, because it, you know, there's a certain tension in the recommendation section, which I think we're kind of hinting towards, between what can organizations do. It's like, you want to immediately progress and say it's all about funders, it's all about funding policies, that's where the money comes from. But at the same time, I felt a sense of urgency to accompany this accumulation of knowledge, which I think is super important in itself, because it doesn't exist. And the arts administration workforce, especially in the entry level, isn't well defined in existing data sets. And, you know, we have to be able to know what we're asking for in order to get it. But to return to the topic of alternatives, I was able to connect with some arts organizations that I think, despite of the disadvantages that they face as organizations of color, as organizations that are committed in their mission to uplifting underrepresented voices in the arts, find a way to overcome these issues, because they absolutely have to. And it's kind of a victim dynamic where, you know, it shouldn't be their responsibility, but ultimately they have a stake in this problem and they have the unique skills to solve it, because they have a sense of urgency and the skills just as well as anyone else. And I think the CEO program is an amazing example of how an organization translates its, aligns its mission with financial practices, creates a program, realizes that its agency lies within generated earned revenue, and seeks a creative mission-based way to do that and grow their budget and their independence. And then only, I think, do they have, because, you know, we always have to prove ourselves in this field before we can actually get the $1 million that the venture capitalists get so easily. Then
I don't think it's easy there either.
Maybe. It all depends, right? It's all comparative. But yeah, I mean, we often have to prove ourselves in terms of actual data and experience, and it's not uncommon to only qualify for a grant after 2 years of programming, which you just have to figure out how to do. And so for the CEO program to sustain a budgetary component of Las Fotos project that is free and can serve as an example for other organizations experiencing the same problems, I think is very revolutionary.
Great. I've got another question, interesting one here. So have the panelists traced a link between generational wealth, supporting entrance in the field, and the ongoing depressed salaries in the field at all but the highest levels? And there's a follow-up question there, which is that, is there a link, do you think, between these depressed salaries and the high proportion of women in the field of arts administration?
I wish we had the answer. I wish we had the answer to that question. I think our what we found here suggests a correlation. I don't know what the answer is.
There was one interesting quote from one of the interviewees in the study that really correlated the two. I think that's a very, very important question for us to ask. And in terms of how we generate future subsequent studies about the way our workforce looks and what could the causation components of salaries, those are exactly the questions we need to be asking. Whether we find the relationships are significant statistically or not, we feel things also as participants in this field, and that shouldn't be discounted.
That's a good response. I've got a question that goes back to this this notion of transparency. So within this would be a sort of interesting tension again. So within employment law, as I recall, there was something recently passed where, you know, an employer can no longer ask an applicant to a job for their prior salary, right? That there's a sense that puts the as a condition of receiving the job. So there's a kind of privacy and leverage that comes with being able to go to a new employer and saying, here's what I want to ask for, here's what I think I'm worth for this job, and keeping that away, you know, keeping that knowledge private so that it can't be leveraged by the employer to sort of bid down someone's salary. And that at the same time, we're talking about wanting these positions and wanting the kind of internal pay structures, which also turns into external pay structures, to be much more visible. So does anybody has confronted this or had thoughts about how these kinds of relationships between privacy and publicity, specifically when it comes to questions of salary, on one hand can be leveraged to the good of the worker, but sometimes might also end up becoming something that can be leveraged by potential employers to be able to understand, you know, where people are coming from, what their salaries already have been, and then puts them in a let's say a compromised negotiating position. Sort of curious about that.
Maybe I can share something. I feel like when I was as I was maneuvering the art world a lot, like my jobs are all slightly different, and job descriptions were slightly different, expectations were slightly different. But as I was sort of yeah, like in an interview, like saying my desired hourly rate or salary, like a lot of jobs require different rates, or a lot of jobs I felt like, yeah, I could have gotten more paid. Like I feel like there's definitely that of there's a lot of shifting, and a lot of arts administrators start sort of not knowing what they want to really settle in, because there is so many different subsections of even with arts administration, right? And I don't know, I think while you're sort of maneuvering that space, I definitely sort of observed how stating my income has sort of impacted the way I was compensated, and that is definitely biased. I think it's a good example of how race and capitalism works. As an employer, if I bring lower wage, obviously they're going to hire me for that. But yeah, so there's a no checking in that sense, and I feel like a lot of jobs are also very nuanced to the point that even though I like talk with my colleagues, like I really don't know how much I should get paid for, like until like much later when I'm like too deep. And in that sense, I like really like that recent change that has been happened about just that. Yeah, but also at the same time, I think like knowing how much people make doing that job, like just like industry wide, is like that transparency is like so great, you know, very helpful.
Absolutely. So I've got a one of our colleagues who's on the Zoom with us, who most people here will probably be familiar with, Laura Zucker. So she also has an answer to the privacy publicity question. So Laura, I'm going to invite you to come in and provide some impromptu feedback, and then we'll move on.
Well, thank you. I experienced this directly coming from the nonprofit field into the government field. At that time, LA County required people to submit prior pay statements, and then realized over time how much this discriminated against both women and people of color. Because if your pay starts lower and your next job is always based on what you were making before, you never get an opportunity to rectify. So as part, I'm happy to say, so when I went to work for the county, I had been working in a nonprofit theater for 10 years, which basically had balanced its books on the backs of the people who worked for it, which is what many nonprofits arts organizations do. And one of the fundamental things we have to deconstruct and change. And I had to make the argument that what I was worth to the county could not be based on what I had been paid in a nonprofit theater. I was only partly successful, but I'm happy to report now 30 years later that the county, as part of its women's initiative, actually outlawed that practice before the state did, in terms of not asking for prior pay statements. So this is something active that organizations can responsibly do, because pay should be worth on a person's skill and experience and the demands of the job, not prior pay.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it. So I want to also ask John and Helen, since you were very much on the front lines here, what are some of the things that you would, what's some of the research and what's some of the work that we could do within the kind of academic research field to continue to sort of support the field and provide some of the foundational, let's call it transparency, that Make or Break as a report is just sort of one step forward? Are there other areas of inquiry that you would be interested to know, or backgrounds or conditions that you'd want to know more about, which I think, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn for Bronwyn and Kobe, that provide the kind of resources that organizations and workers in the field can use in order to advocate for themselves?
I think something that we've been discussing as a team is just having information, like really where is the money going? Like we see the award recipients, we see kind of like who gets grants, who gets this, but I think there needs to be transparency in that, and knowing how much funding is each organization getting. And so we can be aware, like, okay, this large arts institution got that $1 million, but what are they using it for versus what we could use it for? I think that would be interesting. I don't know if that's even possible, but yeah, I'd love to see something like that.
I mean, they certainly have to produce that for the granting organizations themselves, and they have to, provide all that. So it's not as if that information is not readily available. It would be very interesting to see, how that is being applied and in what numbers, especially for individual program projects, or if there are things that are going to operations and so forth. John, did you have any ideas as well?
Not necessarily. I mean, yeah, I think this being conducted periodically would be really awesome, and being able to see change, progress, like really checking on the where everyone's like, standing on would be really nice. But also, I really like that like detailed like suggestions, that recommendations that you make for institutions, and yeah, I would like to see more, because I think it was going to an interesting directions that I definitely felt for, like really that was like exciting to bring up to my team and coworkers, and even my boss.
What I'm going to have one more question for Helen and John. Helen, what's some advice that you would provide to a someone who's just getting ready to enter the field, who is at the entry level? How do you advocate for yourself and navigate, and apart from obviously bringing a copy of Make or Break to every job interview and saying, hey, listen, we've got the numbers, so you can't pull the wool over my eyes. But what's some advice that you would give to people, obviously, that you already do, just starting out in the field, how to ensure that they aren't compromising on salary, aren't compromising on what they're valued, and doing that in a way that sets them up for success in the field and getting the positions that they want, and the salaries that they deserve?
Yeah, I think one thing I wish I knew when entering this field was like the importance of informational interviews, and like really going out there and asking people these questions and asking them how much they make, and taking that information with you. So once you do have the interview and you get the job offer, you kind of already have an idea, how much was this person getting paid for this role? How much can I ask for this role? That was, this concept of informational interview was not a thing for me. It was something I learned a couple years into my career. And I think also once you are in a workplace, like I think I was very lucky to have some really great colleagues at the Skirball, one of whom I think is still on this call. Anna, she really helped me in building my confidence to ask what I'm worth. And, when I was offered a promotion in that space, she was very transparent about what she made, and it allowed me also, again, to ask for that same amount for the previous role she had been in. And I think it goes back to that transparency, not being afraid to ask those questions to those around you. And even if you're not in that network yet, find people through informational interviews who will give you that information that you need.
Yeah, John, did you have some thoughts there too? Yeah.
Yeah, mine's similar. Like, don't be afraid to reach out to people, create like a strong group of where you can share information with your colleagues, coworkers, like a person who works in different institution. I found it incredibly helpful to reach out to person who may work in that like team or like institution, just like ask around. Like not only the pay, but like another thing is like how much you can grow within that position or institution, right? Like, does it really create like a great like wiggle room for you to like grow out? And I think those mostly can be answered with like talking to people, reaching out, keeping that like great connections with people, and never do unpaid internship. I think that's like the most evil thing that exists in the world. So value yourself. Your labor's work.
I agree with John. Don't ever do an unpaid internship. That's the second thing. I think that's one of the first things I tell our students at Las Fotos Project is like, don't get paid in exposure, because that's so often what happens for our youth when they're transitioning out of our program. And secondly, also to add to John's point about asking questions, also like asking people like what the environment is for people of color working in that institution. I think that's something that we need to be transparent about asking as well.
I think those are great suggestions. I think maybe there've been some good conversation going on in the chat too about getting a GuideStar account, looking at organizations 990s. There's a lot of good transparency there. One of the things the 990s don't tell you is what a median salary is in any organization. So you get a picture of who's at the very top. And then you have gross pay for what an organization does and the number of employees, and often you can but they don't distinguish between part-time and full-time, so it's hard to get a real picture about what standard pay is. But having organizations post a median salary, or maybe we can somehow get that onto the 990 form, would be a really interesting way of seeing what could come next. We are at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to just do, we're at the time we're supposed to stop. We got one more question that just came through that I want to put forward, and then we're going to close it up. Do you have any thoughts on the tension between the sentiment among many artists that arts nonprofit executive pay needs to be reduced relative to entry-level pay, and the need for arts administrators to ask for their worth and have equity with non-arts fields?
I can answer that. I mean, I honestly think that's not the battle we need to be fighting. There are very few actually extremely high paid executives in the art world. I think we could count them like on 2 sets of hands. Like, that's not where the real issue is. That's not where the real money is going to. We couldn't cut the pays of the directors of the big museums in LA and fund annual salary, substantial increases in annual salary for all the entry-level employees. That math doesn't work. And so I think focusing our energy on not decreasing someone's value, but increasing a different population's value is really helpful. And by all means, I would love to see a CEO of a museum or a gallery who, to refer back to Helen's comparison of the output of the nonprofit social sector versus the corporate sector sometimes, or the different markets, I would love to see the CEO of a well-engaged, active museum earn as much as a very successful lawyer. I think they contribute more and their value should be higher even. So, but I will say that through my research during the Arts for LA fellowship, I have discovered a really interesting compensation model that is paying all employees the same amount, which that I think merits some consideration and is sort of a democratic egalitarian alignment with conceptual labor issues. So maybe that's a way to kind of offer some sort of diversity in terms of compensation structures.
Thank you. Certainly we need a lot more experimentation, many more models. It's the creative field, so I feel like this is one place where as soon as the arts and cultural sector turns their attention to this, we're going to get a lot of good material to work with. So on that note, I want to thank you, Helen. Thank you, John, very much for joining us and sharing your experience and your expertise. As always, Kobe and Bronwyn, thank you so much. I want to thank Jill Stiegel for providing the back office help and support and organization for all of this. And thank you to Los Angeles County for being part of this partnership for these reports and providing a platform for our alumni and putting out what I think is some really fantastic and important research into the field and doing the service that we know we need to be doing. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll be doing it again soon, so keep an eye peeled. Bye-bye.